Good morning and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Youssef Munayer. I'm head of the Palestine-Israel program and a senior fellow at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us for this webinar titled The Israeli Attack on Jenin, Legal and Political Implications. Earlier this month, the Israeli military carried out an invasion of the Jenin refugee camp in the occupied West Bank, and it amounted to one of the larger scaled Israeli military operations in recent years. Hundreds of troops, as well as armored vehicles and airstrikes, were used in the 48-hour operation, recalling scenes from the brutal repression of the Palestinian Intifada and the siege of the cities in 2002. Our panel today will tackle several questions. What happened during the 2 days when the Israeli military raided the Jenin refugee camp? What human rights abuses and legal violations were committed? What led to this operation? What have the responses been from the different players involved, including allies and international organizations serving the Palestinian people? And what, if anything, changes from here? We're pleased to have with us this morning an excellent panel to discuss what took place in the camp and what the implications will be for all parties involved. We'll begin with about 10 to 12 minutes of remarks from each panelist, followed by a question and answer session with the audience, and we'll try to end promptly at 11:30. Please note that you do not need to wait until the question and answer portion to submit your questions for this morning's speakers. You can send in your questions at any time using the Q&A feature in Zoom or by email to events@arabcenterdc.org. I'll very briefly introduce today's panelists. Dalia Hatuka is a multimedia journalist specializing in Israeli-Palestinian affairs and regional Middle East issues. Susan Akram is a clinical professor at Boston University School of Law, and Daniel Levy is the president of the U.S. Middle East Project. Welcome, all of you, and thank you for being with us today. Dalia, I'm going to turn it over to you to begin with some introductory remarks on what took place in Jenin.
Thank you, Youssef. So as you mentioned, for 48 hours, the Israeli army used its military might to hit Jenin's refugee camp in the northern West Bank. What struck me was that, like you said, the scene was reminiscent of Israel's invasion of the West Bank in 2002. It was perhaps the biggest escalation in Jenin refugee camp in 2 decades. And quite frankly, a lot of people felt that those shocking images that were coming out of there were reminiscent of the Nakba in 1948, since we saw so many people being, expelled or having to leave their homes while the fighting was going on. The Israeli operation, according to the UN, resulted in the highest number of Palestinian fatalities in a single operation in the West Bank since the UN started recording casualties in 2005. As I mentioned, there were so many people who were displaced, about 500 Palestinian families. And it seems that the Israelis are really intent on targeting Jenin, because if we look at the numbers in Jenin Governorate, the number of Palestinian fatalities so far this year, 63, have more than doubled compared with the last period last year, with the same period last year. I think we need to understand that this isn't going to be a one-time thing. The army has vowed to come back, claiming that the camp, one of Palestine's oldest, is a hub for terrorism. But obviously for Palestinians, Jenin refugee camp is an icon for resistance. Many of its young men taking up arms to defend the camp itself, and also to carry out operations against Israeli soldiers and settlers. I think the deployment of brutal force was an attempt by the Israelis, first to deter the armed resistance against the occupation, But also, I mean, if anything, history shows us that it will actually get Palestinians even more determined. So it's not particularly a good tactic on the part of the Israelis. And it's also part of a strategy by the Israeli military to isolate and confine Jenin from the rest of Palestine, to ghettoize it further, the way they did with Gaza over the past decades. I think it's worth mentioning that more recently, Jenin and particularly the camp have become a hub and a refuge for unaffiliated armed groups that have sprung up over the past year or two. It's a new generation of men who act on their own initiative. They don't answer to established hierarchies or organizations or factions. So some are affiliated with Fatah al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades. Some are affiliated with either Hamas or Jihad, or the newly formed Jenin brigades, or nothing at all. Some of them are just not affiliated with any group. And we see that for many years, Jenin has been a sore spot for Israel because it has not managed to crush the tides of resistance, despite many efforts, including using the Palestinian Authority security forces to detain these young men. I would say if there was a mission, or if there was a mission for Israel to achieve in Jenin this time around, Israel has failed to do so, because the mission was to root out the fighters completely. And with it, the PA, which to many Palestinians acts as a proxy for Israel, has lost its capability to reestablish its writ in the area. I mean, you know, in recent years, Jenin has become a no-go zone for Palestinian security forces. And we saw yesterday, the PA president, Mahmoud Abbas, made a short visit to the area, and by the accounts of people in the refugee camp, not a lot of people were there to welcome him. It wasn't reminiscent of the scenes that had happened years ago when Arafat was there, when thousands of people showed up. So that tells us a little bit about how people view the Palestinian Authority. I think, if anything, what the Israelis did manage to do in the camp is two things. They destroyed the camp's infrastructure, and with it, the UNRWA's ability to rebuild, and they traumatized an entire generation of Palestinians. So, you know, the operation caused significant damage to electricity, water, sewage networks. And as we know, UNRWA was already cash strapped. So what they did was destroy the camp, where people are going to be scrambling to rebuild it. The idea is really simple, and Israel does this over and over again, but they don't seem to learn that it doesn't work. So they want people, Palestinians obviously, to turn on each other, on the young fighters. That's always been Israel's strategy, and they've learned nothing obviously from history, because that never happens. And as we mentioned earlier, Jenin has long been a thorn in Israel's side. You know, 2002, it killed more than 50 Palestinians, destroyed large parts of the camp in an 11-day operation. And 20 years later, it returned with a vengeance, following a series of attacks carried out by fighters in the camp inside Israel. But obviously, they didn't need an excuse to get there. The raids by Israeli forces have become the norm, as did attempts to kill or arrest members of different factions, including the Jenin brigades. Last month, an Israeli raid took a surprising turn when explosives were used to disable an armed vehicle, or several armed vehicles. And so this has kind of turned up the pressure for Israel. Also, there's been pressure from the Israeli settlers in the West Bank and their leaders in what many believe is the most right-wing government in Israel's history, So Netanyahu's far-right allies have been calling for a large-scale military operation in the occupied West Bank for months now. I think the attack on Jenin came at a strategic timing also politically for the Israeli regime. It followed the settlers' pogroms against Palestinians. And it also comes amid continued demonstrations from Jewish Israelis against the judicial reform. And so they used the attack on Jenin to kind of regroup consensus among Israeli Jewish citizens on the need for supremacy over Palestinians. And it also comes after the criticized announcement of further illegal settlement expansion in the West Bank, including from the US. I think it's also obviously very much worth mentioning that Jenin is the place where prominent Palestinian American Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh was shot dead, covering the Israeli raids of Palestinian homes in Jenin in May 2022. So Jenin is very much familiar, unfortunately, with these Israeli raids. And the root causes for these raids aren't events that happened a few weeks prior. We're talking about generations being born and living in a camp built in 1953, when not much has changed, and we're now in 2023. So I would say that unless Israel, has managed to root out all these young Palestinian fighters from the camp, then we should expect them to go back again. And that's what a lot of observers also believe.
Thank you, Dalia, very much for that update on what's been taking place on the ground recently in Jenin. I want to turn now to Susan Akram, who can give us a breakdown of the international legal dimensions of the attack on Jenin, and deal with questions of human rights and accountability. Susan?
So thank you for inviting me, Arab Center and Yusuf, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel with Dalia and Daniel. So there's no doubt that what Israel carried out in Jenin constitutes war crimes. And let me begin with detailing what that means, and then address a range of criminal aspects of the attack on Jenin. First, in terms of war crimes, the attack was carried out in the context of an ongoing occupation. And the Geneva Conventions include as war crimes during occupation, willful killings, willfully causing great suffering to an occupied population, and extensive destruction of property not justified by military necessity. War crimes also include intentional attacks against a civilian population, intentionally directing attacks against civilian objects, attacks with knowledge that they will cause loss of life to civilians, attacking or bombarding by whatever means towns and dwellings that are undefended. In addition, attacking buildings, medical units, and transport that are clearly identified as humanitarian, and intentionally depriving civilians of relief supplies or preventing access to means of survival. These are all war crimes in the occupation context. And it's evident that the facts that Dalia has described and that we have read in the press fit these elements of war crimes. But what about the intentional element? Israel claims its attack was to destroy terrorist strongholds in Jenin. Prime Minister Netanyahu justified the attack by saying Israel was defending itself, deterring terrorist attacks, and would continue as long as necessary to restore quiet and security for the citizens of Israel. National Security Minister Ben-Gvir called on the government to launch the attack on Jenin to demolish buildings, eliminate terrorists, not one or two, but tens and hundreds, and if necessary, even thousands. The context of these remarks must also include the official Israeli government policy of massive settlement expansion, 13,000 new settlement homes since the beginning of this year, and annexation of the West Bank. Now, these statements are important for analyzing the criminal aspects of the Jenin attack. As I said, Israel's attacks on an occupied population are criminal in and of themselves because occupation law forbids the occupier to use military attacks against civilian targets in the territory it occupies, which a refugee camp housing thousands of unarmed civilians clearly is. Second, Israel cannot rely on self-defense or necessity arguments to launch attacks on occupied territory it controls, as the International Court of Justice confirmed in the 2004 advisory opinion on the wall. Third, having stated an intention and policy to annex the West Bank, everything Israel does to entrench and make the occupation permanent, including claiming that the attack is to protect Israeli citizens. Everything Israel does in this regard to make the occupation permanent is prohibited as aggression under the UN Charter and criminally prosecutable. Fourth, again, as the International Court of Justice confirmed in 2004, Israel must respect the territorial integrity and political independence of Palestine and refrain from acts or threats of force against any part of Palestine, which the majority of countries in the world and the UN have now recognized as a state. Looking at the other side of the question, is Israel justified in targeting militants in the West Bank? And do they have any rights or criminal responsibility? What is almost never discussed is the law on the right to resist. Occupation law itself protects organized resistance movements and national liberation movements in their right to resist occupation. Of the many UN resolutions that confirm this, I want to mention 3, as they specifically refer to the right of the Palestinian people. UN General Assembly Resolutions 2787 of 1971, 3236 of 1974, and 3743 of 1982 have very explicit language confirming the right of the Palestinian people to regain their rights, quote unquote, by all means, and the legality of people's struggle for self-determination and liberation from colonial and foreign domination by, quote unquote, all available means. Of course, militants are also bound to the constraints of humanitarian law in confining their targets to legitimate military personnel and objects. But summarizing all of this brings us back to the dilemma of a failure of enforcement. The law has always been clear. It has been stated and confirmed, and its violations decried by the UN and international bodies for decades. But Israel has remained unanswerable for past atrocities for decades. Despite the International Criminal Court prosecutor being seized of the Palestine situation since 2014, no prosecutions have ensued for the criminal expansion of settlements or the military operations in Gaza. What must happen now to halt further attacks on Jenin and elsewhere in the West Bank that the Israeli government has clearly indicated are coming is to give teeth to the statehood recognition of Palestine, and for all states that have recognized it to exercise their universal jurisdiction laws to prosecute Israeli perpetrators wherever they travel. There are many tools available for the international community of states, in addition to universal jurisdiction, state sanctions, sanctions on individual military members and policymakers who are responsible for carrying out war crimes, refusal to grant visas, refusal to recognize Israeli passports, and many more. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to take questions afterwards.
Thank you very much for that breakdown, Susan. Before we turn to Daniel, I just want to offer a quick reminder for those listening that you can submit your questions for the panelists through Zoom's Q&A feature or by email to events at arabcenterdc.org. So you can go ahead and send them in before Daniel wraps up, and then we can deal with them during our Q&A session. Daniel, we'll turn it over to you at this point for your introductory remarks. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Yusuf, and it's good to be with you and to be with Susan and Dalia. And I have been listening. I've got a bit of a head cold, so I apologize if my voice sounds a bit off, and if I'm off camera when I'm not talking, I'll spare you the tissues. What I would like to do is focus more on the policy political side, having heard the descriptions both of how this relates to the international legality, or in fact, as we've heard very clearly, the violations of international legality on the part of the Israeli side, and we've heard about the situation on the ground. What I'm going to do then is run through 5 thoughts that I want to share with you on how this relates to Israeli policy, ongoing, current, the dynamics there, and then just share a couple of reflections on where America stands in this. So the first thing I'd say is, in immediate policy terms, now, of course, there's a permanent Israeli presence. We're all aware of that. The historical precedents have been touched on by others. This particular escalatory cycle, I would say, predates the swearing in of the new government. I think we saw in the previous Bennett-Lapid-Gantz government actually a significant uptick in military operations inside Palestinian, these so-called Palestinian areas of limited interim self-governance. And in fact, a return to extrajudicial killings began with the previous government. There's of course been periods, notably the Second Intifada, where that has been a tool of choice. So what I'm trying to get at here is that it's important to acknowledge the elements of both continuity and change of this government, because I think a lot is made of, well, this is the extremism of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, and certainly that is true in terms of their extremism. But let's not forget what has preceded this, and it's a constant. The constants are far more telling and are far more important, I think, for our purposes. What I would, though, go on to say is what this particular coalition, I think, does is to embed a logic of ongoing escalation. In other words, even the windows of relative calm, and I use that term advisedly because what that means is everything goes swimmingly on the Israeli side, and it means ongoing dispossession, disenfranchisement, occupation, denial of human rights for Palestinians. But the windows between these kinds of assaults, I think, are getting shorter. The assaults are getting more frequent. And I think what you see is Netanyahu almost needs, and I'm not saying he has any problem with it, but he almost needs to escalate in order to maintain coalition harmony. So that's one. Number two, I just want to dig down on what I consider to be the inadequacy of a framing that focuses us too much on the excesses of the Ben-Gvir Smotrich folks inside the coalition, or the idea that, well, if one could only get a grip on the settler violence and rein in the armed settler militias. Those things matter. I'm going to suggest a particular way in which they matter in a moment. But what I want to point out here is not only, of course, is that armed settler militia presence allowed in the current government by certain ministers, enabled and encouraged, overseen by the IDF, but crucially here, And the key to understanding what's going on is that there is an inherent structural violence that the system Israel has in place guarantees. That is the nature, and people will be very aware, very familiar with the very well-researched and documented findings of the international human rights organizations, aligning with Palestinian positions, aligning indeed also with Israeli human rights groups like B'Tselem, the Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, that this meets the legal definition of apartheid. Inherent in an apartheid system is an illegitimacy which necessitates structural violence. So this isn't one assault on Jenin. It's not Ben Gvir, Smotrich. It's not just the settler militias. And that squeezing of Palestinian space is the constant. And this brings me to my third point, which I don't want to exaggerate, but which I also would be remiss in not putting on your radar screen, which is that I think there's something. Look, first of all, Jenin refugee camp. What's with that? A refugee camp? Why are there refugees? The narrative in the West is so often hotbed of militancy, not generations of people living without a right to return, without their status being acknowledged, without their rights being acknowledged. And why I mention this here is I've spoken to a number of Israelis, friends, who have really also pointed this out. Is there something particularly poignant? And there wasn't a mass exodus, but to what we had described earlier, that level of destruction, people leaving their homes, the difficulties that there will be in rebuilding, in being able to make many of those areas inhabitable again, because there is a narrative as well as a logic in the current Israeli position of displacement, of the push for a second Nakba. And I don't want to say that there is a direct causal line between excuse me for the background noise. I don't want to say that there is a causal line between the particulars of the mission and the talk of and the threat of a second Nakba, but I also don't think we should ignore that entirely. Nakba in the Israeli discourse has gone from a history denied to something that is threatened against the Palestinians. Penultimate point on this. I think it also means that we have reached something of a decisive point in this impossibility of a Palestinian authority, and we heard about Abbas's visit, the impossibility of a Palestinian authority which does what's written on the tin of cooperation on security with Israel, with America, the training, all those kinds of things, and which represents its own people. Susan spoke about the right under international law of the Palestinian people to resist. You cannot have a Palestinian authority that is representative of Palestinians, but does Israel's work on a security front. And that is coming apart at the seams, and it's, I would argue, coming to a head. I would argue it's particularly important as one thinks about the apartheid framing, that to have an apartheid, you often need a kind of Bantustan system of limited self-governance, which serves the supremacist power. And I think that's what it's come to. I don't want to go into it further in terms of how Palestinians work their way out of that, but it is inevitable that in any liberation struggle, there will be armed resistance. People forget the history of the ANC and Umkhonto with Siswe, its armed wing, etc. Final thing on the Israeli side, I'll just really briefly touch on this. Where does this all fit into the thing that we're often treated to, which is the headlines around the Israeli anti-judicial reform, so-called pro-democracy protests, which in their scope are important. It's interesting. One of the leaders of that, Shikma Bresla, I think is her name, put out a tweet saying, "Come on Saturday night as we stand with our heroes in Jenin, because part of this is making sure that we will have a justice system so they won't be culpable in The Hague." I'm paraphrasing. It actually caused a backlash. It is part of the dominant narrative, but there was a backlash. So I think The depressing thing is that people haven't been tying the threads together of how can you have a democracy which does this. But there is a fraying at the edges. There is some ability to push these kinds of narratives at this time. Quick comment on the US. I have tended to think about this as the low level of ambition of the current administration. And I'm beginning to question whether I'm right and whether one is actually more correct in describing the current US policy as highly ambitious in the following way. Highly ambitious in thinking that after everything I've said, but after everything that we've heard from Susan, Dalia, etc., that they can actually keep this in place. It is actually quite an ambitious project as it's all coming apart to think you can do security assistance, you can do Sharm el-Sheikh, you can do Aqaba, you can pull it all together in that way. Unfortunately, I do think the administration has set out its stall. We saw it in the Nides farewell interview. They seem to be more interested in these couple of extremist ministers or in the judicial reform than in the things that they should really be focused on, which is the ongoing violations of international law. And I think how ridiculous, to be frank, how ridiculous they look and just how exposed they are. In this kind of sense of we're upholding international law, rules-based order in one place, and we're doing exactly the opposite in the other. And that leads me to say, number one, I don't expect a policy change from this administration. You'd be probably amused to hear that Tom Friedman is, he wrote a piece yesterday that is actually, people in Israel are saying, oh, wow, there's a big reassessment. The Biden administration is going to change everything. This is the shtick in the Israeli media today. So you'd probably be surprised to hear that. I think that, of course, is an inaccurate reading. The most important thing, which is the military assistance, the political assistance, the guarantor of Israeli impunity, avoidance of applying international law, which Susan spoke to, that is the key thing that's in place. That means that I think twofold. One, double down on the work to try and change the politics. It could be that as a Democrat administration in the second quarter of this century, the Biden people will look like outliers. That may be excessively optimistic, but they should feel the heat on this issue as people shift the narrative. And secondly, we have to look beyond America. And I think in that respect, the decomposition of this, it's not a rules-based order, it's an American-led order where America can run cover for its allies, whatever rules they're breaking. The way we see that decomposing, the way we see a multipolarity, the way we see a new non-alignment, I think this opens up a vista potentially on the Palestinian issue that it would be remiss to ignore and to continue focusing on high-level American policymakers who are not going to do anything good anytime soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, very much for all of that. Before we turn to audience Q&A, I wanted to maybe do a round of questions for each of you to try to get you to dig in a little bit more on a couple of these questions, and then we'll turn to the audience Q&A. So we'll go in the same order. I'll start with Dalia. I have a couple questions for each of you, and if you could take a couple minutes to deal with these, as we didn't touch on them too much elsewhere in the conversation. So, Dalia, I want to ask you about the Palestinian Authority. A lot of the conversation in the wake of the violence that we've seen, the Israeli operation in Jenin, has been about the lack of control that the Palestinian Authority has, the extent to which that control has deteriorated, particularly in the north of the West Bank, and perhaps even much more of that. And this question of the Palestinian Authority's role in security coordination, juxtaposed with public sentiment towards the fighters who are engaging with the Israeli military in the refugee camp and elsewhere. Can you talk a little bit about the Palestinian Authority? Of course, Mahmoud Abbas has just visited Jenin for the first time in many years. So I'd like for you to unpack that a little bit for us. Also, I wanted to ask you about this question about the Nakba. I mean, one of the most evocative images that came out of the military operation in Jenin was the images of hundreds of Palestinians fleeing their homes while the camp was under attack. Of course, these are refugees who have already fled their homes previously under attack in previous generations. And given, as Daniel mentioned, and as we all know, the growth of the Nakba discourse within an extremist Israeli society that is now calling for more and more expulsion. How are we to understand all of this, and how does it impact sort of Palestinian thinking as they watch these scenes?
So first, I want to talk about, I'm going to start off with how Mahmoud Abbas went into Jenin camp. Basically, Mahmoud Abbas had to get Israel's okay to be able to go to Jenin. And that in itself is, I don't know, alarming. It's not something that we haven't witnessed before. I mean, his entire movements are dictated by the Israelis, but it's interesting to see that he had to take a Jordanian helicopter in order to go to the camp, which he has not visited except for 2 times in his during his presidential his time as president. And when he got there, I would say, speaking, because I spoke to people from the camp, I would say there may have been, I don't know, let's just say 1,000 people. And it's not so much about the numbers, but it's about the fact that people, A, they're displaced, B, they're either mourning their dead, or they're trying to rebuild their homes, or they're concerned about their kids who were taken into prisons. And he's over there, he's using this microphone that's like choppy. You don't hear him. You hear like a couple of words coming out of him. He's tired. His wife is in the hospital. For the lack of a better term, I want to say something in Arabic, like it was a catastrophe, the whole thing. And as usual, it's the people that are around him. And I'm not saying he doesn't have a say in this, but it's the people around him who seem to think that this was a good idea. So I spoke to a few people in the camp, and some, were affiliated with Fatah, some not. The people who were affiliated with Fatah were like, yeah, this is a good opportunity for him to come and kind of reestablish his rapport with people and whatnot. That's understandable. But like, I spoke to one mother whose 2 adult children were taken by the Israelis. They're in an Israeli prison at the moment. And she was telling me, she's like, but why is he here? Like, where was he before? She's like, I can see, snipers, PA security snipers. I can see PA security forces all over the camp. And why are these PA security forces not being used to ward off the Israelis from the camp? I mean, she knows the reason why. And she knows, I know what we all do, because the money that's being pumped into the PA security forces is not being pumped so that the PA security forces can work against Israel. In fact, it's the total opposite. I spoke to one guy, and he told me it's a photo op, and it's an opportunity for Abbas to be like, oh, I'm here, but it's almost like the people around him, Hussein al-Sheikh and Majid Faraj, they were like, wake up, grandpa, we need to go to the camp and do something, And it was laughable if it weren't so tragic, The second thing I want to say is that you mentioned the Nakba, and just the images of women and children and old people walking so slowly and coming. It's almost like you see it in slow motion, kind of like if you put that with the backdrop of like the Nakba pictures, you would get the same heart palpitations, you would get the same feelings. And the worst part is that as these people were fleeing, Israeli soldiers were lobbing tear gas at them. So it's like, it's not even enough that these people had to be expelled from their homes in the dead of night. The children are probably scarred for life, and everybody, we, including us, we're all watching because we don't know what to do, right? We're all just, you know, watching this unfold in front of us. But this is a traumatic experience that will stay with these people and with any Palestinian, with, you know, any Palestinian who watches this, or any human even. They'll watch this as a continuation of the Nakba, and the continuation of the Nakba is not something that we say just, you know, just to kind of like say it for the sake of it. The Nakba is ongoing. Like in Jerusalem, for example, the Ghaith Sublaban family was just thrown out of their home in the old city of Jerusalem, and you see footage of Israeli settlers running and rushing to get that house. And again, you hear from a lot of people who obviously don't know much about the region, and they're like, yeah, but they were squatters, they were this. There's always like something to kind of like deviate from what's important, which is that these people were thrown out onto the street. But this is a part of the Nakba, an ongoing Nakba. Whether it's the shelling of Jenin, I mean, they are shelling a refugee camp. And like we said earlier, why are these people here? Why is there a refugee camp to begin with? The refugee camp is there because it was established in 1953 with the hopes that one day they'll be able to return to their homes. But that hasn't happened. So if you look at the trajectory of the Israeli, you know, shellings and the expulsions, and it's all an ongoing Nakba. Nothing is new in the sense, except that maybe there are new tools, more settlers, you know, more things happening that are leading towards that path.
Thank you, Dalia. Susan, a couple of questions for you. Can you maybe break down for us this idea of self-defense as an occupier? What does that mean? Does it have any legitimacy in international law? And the other issue I was hoping you could talk to us a little bit about our refugee rights to repatriation, since we are talking, of course, about the Jenin refugee camp. And then a bigger picture question for you, and this, you know, ties into something that Daniel mentioned. What is the status of international law in the world today? It seems that everywhere we look, there is a deterioration of international norms. There is a rise of nationalism and isolationism and aggression. Double standards abound. What are the implications of this for Palestinians who for so long have anchored so much of their case before the world in ideas of international law?
So 3 tough questions. Thank you. So I'll start with the rights of an occupier in terms of self-defense. And there are several sources of what rights an occupier has. The first is what we call lex specialis, which is the Geneva Conventions on humanitarian law. And the Geneva Conventions have very specific provisions regarding occupation, the rights both of the occupied, the rights of combatants and non-combatants, and the rights of the occupier. And what the Geneva Conventions regulate are the limited rights of an occupier to take any military action against an occupied population. And the reason for that is that an occupation is supposed to be temporary and only for a specific military necessity. As we know, the Israeli occupation has gone on well past what the Geneva Conventions contemplated in designing these rules of occupation. But in any event, what the Geneva Conventions allow is police activity to control any kind of violence that comes from the occupied population. What the occupier cannot do, because they are occupying that territory, they must treat the civilians in that territory as civilians at all times. Therefore, police response is allowed. Military response against the civilian occupied population is not allowed. So those are the parameters under which we can look at Israel's actions. Setting aside what the Oslo Accords did, Jenin is in Area A. If we even assume that the Oslo Accords were still viable, which they are not because they have been massively breached by Israel on the one hand and to a certain extent by the PA on the other, Area A is supposed to be entirely under Palestinian control. That means anything that Israel does within Area A is illegal under the Oslo agreements. If they had wanted to take some actions against specific people within Jenin, they needed to make that request as any state would make to another state, for the PA to turn those individuals over to them. They do not have the right to invade. And this brings us back to another very important area of law, which is the UN Charter. They don't have the right to invade another territory that does not belong under the sovereign authority of Israel. So we have several layers to look at here in terms of the extent to which Israel has the right to take any actions whatsoever in the territory. Now we come to the UN Charter, and we have a lot of customary international law and treaty law that was described in great detail by the International Court of Justice in the Wall opinion in 2004. It examined very carefully the sources of law that Israel argued were the basis for it to construct the wall. Those same legal sources are relevant here. What the ICJ said was that you can't construct a wall in the territory of another, that is the occupied territory, and claim self-defense. You can construct a wall in your own territory if you want to claim that that's necessary for self-defense. You cannot take the territory of Palestine. And that's based on a lot of sources. The UN Charter, under which that's aggression, the occupation law, which I've just talked about, and also the extent to which a state can claim self-defense in an area that it itself is occupying, right? Coming back again to the limits on Israel's rights to take action in occupied territory. It can take police action, it cannot take military action, particularly when it is targeting areas where the vast majority of people are civilians, let alone it being a refugee camp. So your second question, the right of return. And the right of return, I've talked and written a lot about this. It is one of the strongest rights in international law because it's based on 4 different bodies of law. International humanitarian law, which is what is triggered in this case, which does not allow, even in an armed attack, for the attacker to force people to flee. Unless it is absolutely militarily necessary. And in that case, the attacker must allow people to return immediately. It can't, for example, place a siege on an area. Sieges are not permitted. And it can't disallow for any reason or force people to leave, for example, by denying them water or access to humanitarian assistance during armed conflict. The right of return is very strong under human rights law. It's very strong under refugee law. it's very strong under humanitarian law. So it is one of the strongest rights that exists. And again, I keep coming back to the International Court of Justice opinion in 2004, because it is the only statement we have from an international court about what the rights of Palestinians are and the rights of Israel, certainly in the context of the wall, but it addressed a lot of these issues, including the right of return. And the court stated very clearly, and based it on all the areas of law that I'm talking about, very clearly stated that if people have been displaced by the construction of the wall, Israel is required to allow them to return immediately and restitute and repatriate, restitute their properties and repatriate and pay compensation for all losses and damages. So the right of return exists. It didn't come out of Resolution 194. Resolution 194 was built on these pre-existing areas of law. Right of return remains today for every generation of Palestinian who traces his or her nationality back to the 1924 Lausanne Treaty, which established Palestinian nationality as a matter of international law. So the right of return of Palestinians as nationals, the right of return for any Palestinian displaced during conflict, this remains today and must be implemented not just by Israel, but by the international community. Third is, what is the status of international law? So international law stands on its own. That is, it's an obligation established by treaties that states ratify. Israel is a party to all the treaties that I've mentioned, Geneva Conventions, human rights treaties, many of the human rights treaties. But international law is only as good as the enforcement mechanisms that are available to implement it. And that's where we have a huge structural problem with the way that the United Nations is set up. That is, having divided the powers between the General Assembly and the Security Council, with the use of force exclusively given to 11 members of the Security Council, but in reality, 5 permanent member countries who decide where international law is going to be enforced and where it is not. And that is also true of the International Court of Justice, because if a state is not a party to the Rome Statute and doesn't submit to the jurisdiction of the International Court, then it's the only way to get prosecutions is through decision of the Security Council. And unfortunately, as Daniel has mentioned, the Israeli state has the complete backing of the United States, the Security Council. So our other options are massive civil society campaigns and movements to press individual states, of which people are nationals, to take the kinds of steps that I mentioned: state sanctions, sanctions on individual military members and policymakers, refusal to grant visas, universal jurisdiction within national territories, refusal to recognize Israeli passports. There are a slew of actions that can be taken, but this is going to rely on civil society action to trigger individual state responses.
Thank you, Susan, for those answers to the big questions that I put forward. I really appreciate it. Daniel, turning to you, during and immediately after the Jenin operation, there were multiple Palestinian attacks from a number of different directions. I believe there was an attack in Tel Aviv. There was a killing of a soldier in a settlement. There was some symbolic projectile fire from Gaza and also at the same time from Lebanon. The message seemed to be that if you think that resistance is limited to Jenin or the Jenin refugee camp, that's definitely not the case. Many of the Palestinians who were killed in the operation in Jenin were not even alive in 2002. And yet, once again, it seems like this is the only answer from Israeli security policymakers. Are there voices in the Israeli security establishment who are questioning the efficacy of this policy?
Look, it's an important point because what is very much on my mind as we have this conversation is alongside what this means for Palestinians, just how misguided this is for Israel and for Israeli Jews. And the point that I think has been made by everyone is it flies in the face not only of the history in this region, the history between Palestinians and Israelis, but it flies in the face of accumulated evidence across multiple struggles for liberation. To expect that there can be a military security solution, to expect that this ends well for Israel. So I think it's remarkably ill-advised for the Israeli side to pursue this. In that respect, my answer to your question, Yusuf, is a little frustrating, because I think the answer would include the following. Yes, look, there is certainly concern in the Israeli, there is certainly concern in the Israeli security establishment that there is a level of provocation which has a more obvious immediate boomerang, rather than what we're talking about, which is the broader guaranteed insecurity of the structural violence of a system like this over time. So there's concern at the immediate boomerang. I think there is concern at the collapse of the PA and its security forces. But what I see very little evidence of is a broader strategic rethink that goes beyond repositioning the terms and granular details of what management of Palestinian disenfranchisement, management of occupation, management of rights denial looks like. So I do think that, broadly speaking, and yes, you do have people who leave and then have a more robust critique. But I think, broadly speaking, there is not a voice inside the system which is saying, branch, reassessment of how we relate to our equities vis-a-vis the Palestinians in a way which would offer a future which is in any way respecting of Palestinian rights and dignity and offers a hope for the future. And by the way, I think they're getting this horribly wrong. I think in the 90s, Israel may have been very wise had it have taken an approach which said, my goodness, we're about to get 78%. We're about to get a resolution on the refugee issue pretty much on our terms. We're going to get the world behind this. We're going to have a Palestinian leadership that will sign up to this, that is in some way at that stage, I think, still able to carry, unlike what we heard from Dalia, especially about the PA today, that could carry such a decision with its own people. Let's go the extra mile, not the extra several hundred square miles, but let's go the extra mile. This is remarkable, and I think they didn't do that. It would have been an unjust, but perhaps a realizable separation and end of occupation. And I think the path from the inability to do that then to the embedded apartheid reality of today speaks volumes for how short-sighted, and I think Israel gets this wrong on the regional front as well. I think the idea And we saw this in the Qatar World Cup. The idea, we made peace with you, you are our friends now. The idea that this is going to generate credibility, legitimacy, is wrong. And the idea also that Israel can, the rest of the region is in an interesting place, also as it moves on from American unipolarity, what we've seen between Saudi and Iran. So I just don't think it adds up. And what I'm saying is, inside the Israeli security system, they are not, I think, able to have that strategic, because I think even those who perhaps were capable of seeing it in those terms, I think they look at that, they look at the reality of the politics, they look at the reality that every Zionist party on the opposition benches backed the Jenin operation. They look at where that is at, and what's the point in even banging my head against a brick wall thinking that there can be a fundamental reshift. The other thing to point out is there was a conscious position on the part of the settler movement to integrate more thoroughly into the military, going to officer training, getting their kids to go through officer training school into the more senior echelons, and that is beginning to play out. So this idea that the oasis of realist sanity is in the Israeli security establishment, only to a limited extent, if at all, B, the timer is running out on that, given who is coming through the ranks.
Yeah, I want to ask you also one last question about the United States.
Okay.
The military operation in Jenin, I think, makes it pretty clear that the trajectory of Israeli military violence is going to escalate. And yet, U.S. policymakers seem completely unbothered and unalarmed, even after Netanyahu was on record talking about smashing the idea of Palestinian statehood. We still hear platitudes from Washington about a two-state vision. How long is this sustainable?
In months, hours? So, look, I think it's an accurate description of where the US is at. I think Susan's point that international law does not self-implement. Let's remind ourselves who uses their veto in the UN Security Council more often than any other permanent 5-member, and on what subject they use that. So half of all the vetoes in the UN Security Council have been American vetoes, Massimino, and America overwhelmingly, and in fact I think virtually all of them have been to guarantee Israeli immunity and impunity and an absence of accountability. How long? I must admit, Yusuf, that I look for the answer to that question more in global geopolitical terms than I do in domestic American terms. And you guys are in DC, and I apologize for kind of raining on that parade. I think important advances have been seen in terms of narratives around this issue, in terms of trying to make these arguments. And we see those every day. And I would encourage people, don't give up, keep up that good fight. But I do think that to the extent to which we are seeing a quite relentless acceleration of the emergence, the nascent emergence, we're not there, of what might be a more multi-power, non-zero sum, democratic, multilateralist order. If we see that come forward, and I think there is where the greater hope lie, because I think the erosion of Israeli impunity runs via the erosion of American impunity. And so that's the thought I would share, because I fear that the sustainability in American political terms has a resilience to it, which is incredibly depressing. So I'm not giving a date, sorry.
I appreciate the effort. Thank you very much, Daniel. turning now to questions from our audience, I'll paraphrase a couple of these. We'll start by directing one to Dalia and also to Susan, two that are sort of interrelated. Dalia, we've seen the sort of the security situation evolve in the West Bank, devolve maybe is a better way to put it, and tactically what we're seeing among militant groups in the West Bank is changing. We're seeing a greater use of improvised explosive devices. We're starting to see reports about some sort of rudimentary rockets being launched from the West Bank. And all of these things, I think, point to, of course, the sustained militant activity as well. All these things point to a continued deterioration of the Palestinian Authority's control. What do you see as the prospects for the PA's control over these areas? Is that something that can be reattained, or are these are these groups likely to continue to grow and continue to challenge the Palestinian Authority's authority?
Thanks, Yusuf, for that question. I think ultimately the PA will continue to basically go down the same path that it has been on for a while, because ultimately it's all it's all that it knows, but also because that's what the PA exists for. So asking it to do something else would mean its demise, and it's not going to happen. The people at the helm of this, Abbas and a few other people, are gaining a lot from being in that position, whether it's by getting VIP status, by getting cars, by getting lots of money. And I'm putting this very simply just to kind of like explain it in a way that a lot of us can understand. But at the end of the day, the PA has no reason to change its trajectory or to change its path. In terms of having security, a lot of people ask me like why there isn't a third intifada. And part of the answer to that is that the PA is there to ensure that this doesn't happen, to ensure that kids don't go to military installations or checkpoints and throw rocks and whatnot. The number of students, whether they're affiliated with Hamas or not, in PA prisons is astounding. The torture that goes on in some of the PA prisons is also astounding. So there's all these things that go on behind the scenes, so to speak, to ensure that not just a third intifada, but any kind of armed resistance or even non-armed resistance can be carried out. I mean, we've heard Abbas on multiple occasions talk about non-violent resistance, but what is that? What is that when we've seen all these villages and towns like Bil'in and other places go out and demonstrate peacefully, and they've been met with live ammunition, and a lot of them have been killed. And so at the end of the day, the PA has done nothing to support either that or that. So the PA is just there to ensure that the status quo remains, because it's what's good for its own people, for a handful of people who are sitting at the helm of things. The issue now is that what happens when Abbas, passes away, like we all will at some point. And what does Israel do at that point? Is it going to be one of his right-hand men who will take over? That's a question that's been on the mind of a lot of people. But it's not so much who will follow Abbas as it is the system that's in place to ensure that the same thing happens whether Abbas is there or not. Because ultimately, he is surrounded by all these people who tell him, yes, you're doing the right thing, they're yes men. And but the system is there, it's in place. And I can't for the life of me think of anyone who will take over, who will be like, or will be allowed to change things, to take a different, to take a detour or take a different path. So at the end of the day, I think the PA's hold on the West Bank is not gonna, I mean, where does the PA like really exercise authority except in, Shara al-Tira, like the Tira street, where all the cafes are. Even there, the police can't really do anything. They can't issue parking tickets. So ultimately, what you have is a PA that's there to provide jobs and to provide money to people, so that they could go to their jobs and do absolutely nothing. And at the end of the day, the security itself is up to these individuals, and that's why you saw that the PA had to coordinate with the Jenin brigades before Abbas went to the Jenin camp, because they're not in charge. These guys are, and that seems to be something that's going to happen, may happen all over the West Bank, where the PA has to establish these, lines of communication with these groups that are popping up in exchange for other things. Like, for example, we heard that for the Jenin brigades to allow Abbas to come in and, do all this peacefully, and they removed the IEDs or whatever you want to call them. In exchange, they wanted some of their men who are in PA prisons to be released. So I think these are some of the things that we're going to see. And I apologize for running a little late on this answer.
No problem. Daniel, you have a point that you want to make here?
Yeah, just to follow up on what Dalia said, which is to make clear to people what is probably obvious, the link between what Dalia has just said and what we were discussing before. How long can America sustain this approach? As long as there is a PA in place that one can, therefore hide behind. Therefore, they attend the Aqaba Sharm summits. Therefore, America can say, this is, we're working with the Israelis, the Palestinians. If the PA has that narrative, that's a crucial piece of the furniture of keeping this in place. And I think you can already see that that's the approach of the PA's backers, which is Israel and America primarily. That's their approach to the succession, that it becomes a question of musical chairs rather than a question of political renewal. Because I think that there's a fundamental disconnect between what the PA is designed to do in the eyes of those who sustain it and what is needed for Palestinians. But I hope you're wrong.
Thank you, Daniel. Susan, there are a couple of questions that come from the audience that I wanted to direct your way, and a couple of these are interrelated. One of them, again, focusing on the PA and also the Oslo agreements, which of course set up the PA and the different stratified areas within the West Bank where they have authority, so to speak. One question asks, can you discuss the legal implications for Israel if there is a collapse of the PA? What, if anything, changes? And another one asks about the legal standing of the Oslo Accords given the situation on the ground today. We know, of course, there is an ICJ opinion that is pending. If you could tackle these questions, it'd be great.
Yes, so let me start with the last one. They're both linked, as you noted. But in terms of Oslo has been breached a long time ago, and I would argue materially breached, because the divisions have not been respected, the territorial integrity has not been respected, and the promise for discussions, negotiations, and resolution on the final status questions has never come about. And so from a purely legal contractual perspective, the agreement, there really was a declaration of principles and one agreement, have been completely breached. So, and really primarily by Israel. So for Israel both to breach and then claim that they are acting in accord with the Oslo commitments is rather ridiculous. But even as I mentioned earlier, if we set that aside and say that the Oslo territorial agreements and administrative and military aspects of the agreements are still extant, Israel has no authority to be in Area A at all. So that's really the most important thing to understand in the context of our discussion today. The coordination between the Palestinian Authority and Israel is a bit of a farce, because frankly, Israel, as we all know, is in control of areas A, B, and C. Full control, not just administrative, not just military, not shared control. Israel decides who enters, who exits, who is wanted, who should be turned over to them, when they want to enter any part of Palestine, whether it's A, B, or C. And so you can't even pretend that Oslo has any meaning today at all. The other part of the question has to do with Israel's obligations. Is that right? Could you rephrase that for me once more?
Yes. Israel's legal obligations in the event of a collapse of the PA.
Well, as long as Israel is militarily occupying any part of Palestine, Israel remains the obligated party to maintain the needs and rights of the occupied population. So that remains true, even though the occupation has gone well past the rules. The rules still have a sort of minimum threshold of what the occupying power must do, and it must preserve the rights of the occupied population. So whatever happens to the PA is irrelevant to that fundamental obligation that Israel continues to have under the Geneva Conventions.
Thank you, Susan. And we'll have a couple more questions that I'll direct to Daniel here from the audience. We've seen in the last several months a very notable increase in settler violence, settler attacks against Palestinians across the West Bank. How does this sort of play into Palestinian attacks and Palestinian militancy? Do you see an interrelation between these things and the military's response or lack of response to settler violence as driving these dynamics? That's one. The other question relates to the timing of this operation and whether or not this was aimed at distracting from the massive protests that are taking place against the Israeli government's efforts to overhaul the judicial system in the state of Israel?
Yeah, look, I think obviously there's a part of the settler violence which generates an immediate counter-reaction. I'm sorry. And so a driver, yes. The primary driver, I would not draw that conclusion. I think the primary driver are the terms of the permanent occupation and the actions of the military, which I think are far more significant in defining the restrictions on Palestinian lives. But yeah, no, I mean, look, also the settlers are, it's a particular kind of provocation. Quite often the settlers will do something wanting to get a Palestinian response because then the IDF moves in. So I think there is this symbiotic relationship between settler violence and state violence. And really, I'm almost reluctant to draw a distinction between the two. I mean, I've heard my friends in Breaking the Silence talk about this. And quite often when soldiers rock up, the person giving the security briefing is the head of security in the settlement. So each settlement has its own security apparatus. This isn't uniformed IDF military, but they absolutely work together. That's distinct from technically when settlers go on the rampage. But I think one should put it in the context of there has not historically been a serious prevention of settler violence. What you have today is perhaps, though, the most permissive environment there has ever been. So I think we should acknowledge what the permissive environment, the encouragement, does to the cycle of reprisals which settler provocations are designed to put into play. Distraction from the protests. And it's interesting because this theoretically plays out in multiple ways, Yusuf. Look, I don't think this government, or indeed Israeli governments, full stop, need the added benefit of distracting from something in order to enact violence on Palestinians, including the kind of assault we saw on Jenin. I do think that to the extent to which there is a little more coherence and gelling in this governing coalition of Netanyahu, which just couldn't get its act together for several months, it feels like there is a relationship between do your worst against Palestinians and the ability to hold the coalition together and to get industrial quiet with the religious Zionist faction and its sub-factions, etc. I do think that Netanyahu hoped that a period of negotiation under the auspices of the president, while the judicial reforms were in a hiatus, would lead to a significant dissipation, a significant downturn in the demonstrations. It only happened to a certain degree. I think it's reasonable to speculate that he then hoped that what happened in Gaza and perhaps what happened in Jenin would also have a knock-on effect and people would shift focus. It hasn't worked for him. I don't think, I do not think the only impetus was the distraction. It's been actually quite impressive, the extent to which there was an ability really to generate and mobilize a very significant turnout on the part of those protesters this week. So they got the numbers out again. There's an intriguing additional angle to this, which is some people are suggesting that for Netanyahu, it's not so much the distraction, it's that he can turn around to his own party and say, listen, we just have to put this on hold for a minute because we're in a national security crisis. So in other words, his excuse for not moving ahead with judicial reform is what's going on. That speculation, I haven't seen it. Obviously, it hasn't been borne out. Let's see if they finish the legislation before the summer recess. That doesn't ring right for me, but yeah, that's one thing people have raised.
Well, we do know with those protests, as you noted, there was, I think, only 1 week that they did not take place, and that was, of course, during the time that Israel was bombing the Gaza Strip, that Islamic Jihad was sending rockets into Israel, and of course, we know that that series of events also began and was rooted in Jenin after the death of Khadr Adnan, a Palestinian prisoner in Israeli custody. Well, thank you all for taking on the questions from our audience. This has been a really in-depth conversation about what has taken place in Jenin. I really appreciate you all being with us and taking the time to address the audience today. Thank you to our audience for joining and engaging with our speakers, and our speakers, of course, for being so generous with their time and insights. Apologies, of course, to anyone whose question we did not get to in time. And please continue to follow the center's work at arabcenterdc.org. Thank you all.